So the last message I shared was about recognizing and declaring what I called and what we call our first need first. I don't know if you remember, that was a couple weeks ago. And we saw that in particular in the story of Bartimaeus, and actually in the week before we talked about victory, and we saw a similar story when we read about Jehoshaphat and what God called him to do. And today's message is kind of related, I guess. Maybe it's a part 2, maybe it's a part 3, maybe it's a standalone. I guess you can figure that out for yourself. But it's very, very interesting how when we start wrapping our heads around these concepts, they start to pull so much together for us. And these messages, maybe they start to sound kind of related in what they teach. Today we're going to be in Mark 9, verses 14 through 29. I'll give you a moment to turn there. Mark 9, 14 through 29. Before we begin, I want to just open with a word of prayer. Lord, I thank you for this day. I thank you, Lord, for the opportunity for us to support these missionaries and the great work they're doing in your name across the world, bringing people to know you, Lord. And I thank you for blessing us so richly that we're able to do that. Lord, I ask that you would have your hand on their work, that you would set a hedge of protection around them. Some of them, Lord, are in very dangerous places right now, and it's such an uncertain time all over the world. Lord, I thank you for this day. I thank you for this time to come together to worship and celebrate you and to dig into your word. In Jesus' name, amen. Mark 9, 14 through 29, and I'll be reading from the New King James. Verse 14, and when he came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them and scribes disputing with them. Immediately when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed, and running to him greeted him. And he asked the scribes, what are you discussing with him? Then one of the crowd answered and said, Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit, and wherever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, it gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not. He answered him and said, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me. Then they brought him to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. So he asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood. And often he's thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Jesus said to him, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. When Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more. Then the spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him. And he became as one dead, so that many said, he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, why could we not cast it out? So he said to them, this kind can only come out by nothing but prayer and fasting. So here we see kind of a problem of spiritual weakness, or maybe spiritual immaturity and doubt, and we see the product of that in this teaching, in this passage here. So I want to set the scene. So this is right after the Transfiguration. Jesus had just taken the three up the mountain, Peter, James, and John, and he had left the remainder at the bottom of the hill. And we don't really know why, but there's things we can speculate on here. We could say that maybe Peter was chosen because he was to be the leader of the early church. Maybe John was chosen because he was to receive the revelation, and maybe James was chosen because he was the first to be martyred for his faith. But these were the same three, and we see this kind of pattern repeating. These are the same three that he took with him when he went deeper into the Garden of Gethsemane. These are the same three that he had present with him when he brought Jairus' daughter back. So we kind of see this recurring theme. But it could also be said that these three were a little rough around the edges. And we know that about Peter. He's very well known for that, right? But James and John, let's remember, Jesus called them the sons of thunder. And if we remember when Jesus was passing through Samaria and the people were giving him kind of a hard time, what did James and John say? Lord, should we call fire down on them and just end this nonsense now? Remember that? So maybe a little rough around the edges, these guys. And so maybe Jesus was, I don't know, maybe he was kind of keeping these three close by to keep an eye on them. But one thing we do know, and one thing we can kind of glean as we read about these guys in Scripture, is that all three of these guys were kind of leaders in that group. Yes, they were, we could count them as maybe the closest, the three that were closest to Christ, but they all had a degree of a leadership skill, especially Peter, and we know that for sure, right? And Christ affirmed that. So when they go up to the mountain, at the Mount of Transfiguration, they have the others left behind. And so maybe they were feeling a little leaderless at that point. And so with that probably came a degree of insecurity, a degree of uncertainty. So now Jesus and the three are coming back down the mountain, and they come upon this, it says the big multitude, the big crowd, and there's an argument going on. There's some debating and bickering going on with the scribes. And so the scribes, just let's clarify with the scribes who these guys were. These were the intellectual leaders. These are the guys that were in charge of making sure that the word, when a copy of the word was made, that it was accurate to the letter. In fact, they would count the letters, and they would count the spaces, and they would compare. And if there was one mistake, it was they didn't have erasable ink back then. They would start over. They couldn't just backspace, right? So these are the guys that were so meticulous about the word. And so they were teachers, they were scholars. Their job they almost became enforcers of the law, I guess is a good way of saying it. In fact, they went a little too far with this, so that they had decided at one point, whenever it was, to maybe put some tighter controls around this so that they could better be sure that the word was being followed, the law was being followed perfectly. And so here we start to see all of these man-made laws and rules come in, and love starts to be pushed aside. Okay? And we hear about these guys a lot in Russ's teachings of the parables back there. And I'm sure they started out with good intentions, but it kind of got away from them a little bit. So it got to the point where the outward appearance of holiness, this keeping with the law, making sure that you were doing the right things at the right times in the right ways and dressed right and all this stuff, almost to them became the thing that they were looking to find flaw in people. So these guys are there too. And if you haven't been able to get to Sunday school, I really encourage you. You expected this, didn't you? If you haven't been able to get to Sunday school, I really encourage you to get to Sunday school so you can hear Russ's teaching on the parables. It's absolutely amazing. So these guys, all their legalism, their lack of love, ended up leading to a lot of confrontation with Christ. And again, we hear that in the parables that we're learning about, but we're seeing it here too. We don't have a whole lot of detail when we read here. We're not given a whole lot of detail about exactly what this arguing, this bickering that was going on, what it was about. But we can make a few assumptions based on what we read and who we know was there, and what we do read in Scripture, what the things that occur, these events that occur time and time again. So let's dig in here. Verse 14, and when he came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them, and the scribes disputing with them. Immediately when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed, and running to him, greeted him. So they come down from the mountain. There's this great multitude here, and we have these people, the crowd, who some had been likely following Jesus, some maybe were just there because they were just there. And likely a lot of these people had heard the great things Jesus was doing, or had seen them, or maybe again they were just passing through at the moment. But the disciples are there, the remaining disciples, the 9 that did not join on the Mountain of Transfiguration here. And they're in the middle of this arguing, this bickering. And remember, to this point, they were kind of leaderless. Christ was up on the mount, the other 3 were up there, and these guys were left to their own devices down there. And the scribes, as usual, were waiting, watching, following, looking for a mistake, looking for some breach of the law that they could pounce on, and they could make accusations over, as that was kind of their character to do that. And apparently they found one here, we can assume, because these disciples of Jesus were not able to deliver this boy from this spirit. They were not able to heal him or change his condition. So they were likely ridiculing and shaming the disciples even further, especially knowing that there was a crowd here that they could get to, a crowd they could influence, who maybe were in the valley of indecision, maybe they were following Jesus, and these guys are looking to discredit not just the disciples, but by discrediting the disciples, discredit Jesus. Are you with me? It says that when he came to them, the people were greatly amazed. Now, we don't really know why it says that. There's a few different opinions on this, and we can form our own opinion, but remember, there's not one idle word in this book, is there? So if it says the people were greatly amazed, there's a reason for it, and we can maybe consider that maybe it was because when Jesus came down from the mountain, he still had some of that countenance about him that he took on when he was up there. We could assume or maybe wonder if, well, maybe they were so greatly amazed because of the perfect timing. Again, these moments that Jesus shows up just at the right time in just the right circumstances to meet just the right needs. And look at what happened here. By showing up at that moment, he saves the disciples that were down there and caught in this bitter dispute. He saves them from further ridicule and embarrassment, and we'll see how in just a moment. He shows up to help this boy. He shows up to help this father. He shows up to settle this debate and to teach a very important lesson here, not just to the scribes, but to the crowds and to the father of this boy and the disciples, actually. But the focus that we immediately start to see here is that Jesus was focused on the father, the boy's father. Here we have this boy who is being tormented and thrown into the fire and thrown into the water. The enemy had made repeated attempts to destroy this boy. And Jesus comes and he focuses his attention on the father. Doesn't he? But Jesus, like I said a moment ago, arrives exactly when this man needs him the most. Why do I say that? This guy was on the fence now, it seems. His faith had been shaken. His faith was weakened. He had witnessed, and I'll call it this, he had witnessed a Christian failure. He had witnessed a weakness in faith and power. And around him were all the voices of the world, a multitude. This isn't just a crowd. This is a crowd. We're talking a multitude, which is crowds upon crowds, if you look at the root word there. And so this guy who clearly came with a degree of faith because he brought his son with intent, is now, his faith is a little shaken, it seems. And remember, all the while, the scribes are seeing the whole thing. And we could be pretty sure that they probably pounced on that failure to meet the need of this boy. The disciples couldn't help. And the scribes were great, I don't mean the word great, but they were great men of influence, right? People were, they respected them. They were probably a little afraid of them because they didn't want to be judged. They didn't want to be called out for their mistakes and their failures. And let's remember also that what this boy was facing, there were many conditions in that day that were considered culturally shameful. And that's what they're dealing with here. This sort of spiritual affliction, I'll say, things like seizures, things like blindness, they were often attributed to sin. They were causes for shame culturally at that time, and embarrassment for the family because of the cultural shame that comes with them, and the scribes are among the first to make that declaration and point that out. Are you with me on that? So this guy steps out in faith, not worried about the shame, not worried about what society thinks, what culture thinks, and he comes there, doesn't really know Jesus yet, does he? But he comes there with a degree, at least a degree of faith. And now everything kind of falls apart. The disciples can't help him. These guys are the guys that are closest to Jesus Christ, and they can't help him. In the meantime, I've got these scribes back here screaming and hollering, see, we told you. This is all nonsense. And then we have the undecided in this multitude, and there was probably a great many of them who are maybe thinking, you know what, maybe these guys back here were right. And so we have this poor father with this poor boy who's been so afflicted and so tormented and suffered so greatly. And now the father's faith is shaken, and we see that here. So now it seems he's doubting too. In verse 16 it says, and he, Jesus, asked the scribes, what are you discussing with them? So the first thing Jesus does is, again, he draws the attention away from the disciples and gets this whole argument to kind of stop. So he's giving the disciples a moment to just kind of regroup and collect themselves, and he's drawing the attention away and putting it on himself. Now notice what happens next. So he asks them a question. He asked the scribes a question. It says that right there. And he asked the scribes, what are you discussing with them? The scribes didn't answer him, did they? The disciples didn't answer him. The only person who answered him was the boy's father. Everybody was silent. Verse 17, now one of the crowd answered and said, Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit, and whenever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not. So in the midst of this great multitude, there is silence. Jesus asked the question, what are you guys arguing about? What are you guys talking about? What are you asking of them? There's silence. And this man who came in faith, whose faith is now shaken because of a moment of, we can call it weakness, we can call it a failure, we can call it whatever we want. Now his faith is shaken further, and he says this in front of the whole multitude. In front of the scribes who were just waiting for this moment, he says, but they could not. Imagine the response from the scribes at this moment. There was probably quite an uproar. Normally, they were the ones calling out failure. Normally, they were the ones finding the mistakes. And here, this guy inadvertently does it for them. He says they weren't able to do what they said. What I thought, what I heard, what I was told they could do. So now, we talk a lot about the people in the Valley of Indecision, and if you think of a multitude, I'm sure there was a bunch of those in there too, who had started to hear about Jesus and they were going to go check it out. They wanted to see if this thing was real. They wanted to see if this faith was genuine. They wanted to make their decision based on what they saw, what they experienced, not just on what they had heard. Like we've said before, they're not going to run on somebody else's gasoline. They're going to go and they want to get this for themselves. And so it's safe to imagine that at this point, some people are starting to lean a little. Some people are starting to wonder and to waver a little. Maybe some more faith is being shaken. And we see that. So these people are being influenced by what they saw, by what they did not see, and by the reaction of these religious leaders, these influential scholars, these men of the law, these experts in the Mosaic law. But we see that a lot in the world today. You don't really see a whole lot about the churches in the media until there's a problem in the church. When there's a church scandal, boy, it's front page news. But you don't hear a whole lot on CNN or any of the other media outlets about the miracles that are happening out there, about these people that are being saved by the thousands at some of these meetings in the middle of nowhere that we don't maybe have exposure to. Faithless, defeated Christians affect, and we're seeing this here, faithless, defeated Christians, weakened Christians affect the testimony and the faith of people who don't yet know Christ. And we're seeing that here on. It has an impact on their decision to follow Jesus. And it's happening right here, and it's influencing the crowd. And so Jesus says in verse 19, he answered him and said, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me. So we see here this rebuke from Jesus, and I think maybe it's a little more than just a rebuke. He's anguished right now. He's saddened here by this lack of faith. And he's not just calling out one group. He's not saying the disciples, you weren't able to do this. He's not rebuking them. He's not saying scribes, you're denying, you're refusing. He's not rebuking them. He says, oh, faithless generation. He's talking about everybody. Who's faithless? The crowd, the scribes, and even the disciples and the father of the boy. At this moment in time, Jesus is saying, faithless generation. Didn't make any exclusions in that statement, did he? So we can imagine now things get pretty quiet at that statement, right? Things got pretty quiet when I said it in here. When I just read it, things got a little quiet. We can imagine how quiet it may have gotten at that scene with the multitude, right? But despite this response from Jesus, despite the anguish, how this faithlessness, how this doubt anguished his heart, what does he do? He shows mercy, he shows love and compassion by saying what? Bring him to me. Bring him to me. Verse 20, and they brought him to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him. He fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. So this spirit that sees this boy, sees Jesus, and he knows what's coming. He knows his time is short, so he's going to do as much damage as he can. In the few moments he's got left, he's going to try again to destroy this child. One last attack, I guess. Now, some translations, I think, call it a seizure. Some call it a convulsion. In fact, I think Matthew's gospel says an epileptic seizure. But it still also speaks of the spiritual event, the spiritual attack that's occurring here. But one thing is evident, regardless of which gospel you're reading this from. There is probably an underlying, what we would consider an underlying medical condition here. But don't think for a moment that if somebody has that sort of underlying medical condition, that the enemy's not going to jump on that, and he's not going to try to use it, and he's not going to try to use it against that person. He's going to try to do more harm in that weak area of that person's life. And it's not just physical. He will find the weakness that we all have, and he will capitalize on it, and he'll do as much damage as he can with it, and we see it right here. Verse 21, so he, Jesus, asked the Father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood, and often he's thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. So we get the sense here that this spirit is a particularly dangerous and aggressive one, a very dangerous one. The Father says often it throws him into the fire and the water to destroy him. So we can also imagine, now I mentioned earlier about how some of these afflictions that people had in the day were considered culturally shameful. Well, now we can imagine, if we're thinking that this boy has often been thrown into the fire and often been thrown into the water, that there are probably a great many signs of these physical attacks. There's probably a lot of scars that this boy is bearing. There's probably some physical presentation of these attacks. Even further cause, back then, further cause for shame, further cause for embarrassment in the family, because culturally there was a stigma on it that it was shameful. Just like blindness, they said, what sin did he commit to be blind? Probably a little bit of disfigurement going on with this poor boy. And as I said earlier, now at this point, the Father's faith has been shaken a little bit by the events that have happened in front of him and by the influence of the world, the crowd around him, which in that crowd, the disciples, the crowd, and the scribes, of course, that is a picture of the world around us, isn't it? And so his faith has been a little wounded here. His faith has been a little weakened. What faith he came with has been shaken a little bit. Verse 22, and this is continuing verse 22. The Father says, but if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. We talked about speaking your first need first, and that's what the father of this boy is doing right here. How is he doing that? If you can do anything. He's saying, I came here in faith, and my faith is shaking. If you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And again, we can imagine how this grieves Jesus to hear this from this man. He's shaken, his faith is shaken, but he speaks it plainly to Jesus, doesn't he? The first thing he speaks to Jesus, if you can do anything. So again, I said this likely grieved Jesus, but not just that. The boy's condition grieved Jesus. The condition of the man's heart, the father's heart, grieved Jesus. The crowd and their doubt grieved Jesus. The scribes and their lack of love grieved Jesus. The scribes only stood, watched, and ridiculed. They did nothing, right? Shouldn't they have been able to help? Well, what does Jesus do? What do we see him do here? He focuses on the terrible condition, not only of the boy, but he works with the father first, addressing that first need first. And we see in the words here that the pain that this father was feeling, in fact, he was begging Jesus to have compassion on him. If you read this account in Matthew 17, it says, "And when they came to the multitude, a man came to him, knelt down, and said, 'Lord, have mercy on my son.'" This guy just drops to his knees in anguish, in desperation, in sadness. "Have mercy on my son," he said. So Jesus knew the suffering not only of this boy, but he saw the suffering in the father's heart. He knew what he was going through. And it was his love for his son that drove him to seek Jesus in the first place. Again, that's a tender thing to Jesus, isn't it? He knew the suffering that this man was going through because of what his son was enduring. But he also recognized the boldness that it took for this man to step out of all of those social stigmas that come with all of these afflictions that they're facing and all the problems they've got, and the physical presentation that must come with this disfiguration from being thrown in the fire and thrown in the water, and all these attempts the Spirit made to destroy this boy. This man still had enough faith and enough boldness to bring him out. Jesus knew the need that this family was suffering through, right? But look what happens here. In fact, he knew the need way before the need was there, right? But he still asks this father to tell him the story. Verse 21, so he, Jesus, asked the father, how long has this been happening to him? Why would he ask him that if he already knows, doesn't he? It's not because he didn't already know. This is where the work is starting. The work in healing and restoring and redeeming this boy is starting right here with the work that Jesus is doing in the Father. He wanted the father of this boy to recognize his first need first, his weakened faith. The father said what? If you can do anything. So Jesus is addressing this first. He wanted to get the boy's father apart from this crowd, away from the crowd, and get him to do what? To focus on him. Not the voices around him, not these declarations of, see, look, it's not going to work. See, look, they're failing. See, look, they're weak. See, look, everything they say doesn't seem to be true. Jesus says, forget all that. And he's drawing this man in and asking him the question so that this man will do what? He'll tell him his story. Not so Jesus can learn it. So this man can start self-examination and start to see within himself his greatest need. You with me? The crowd was unsure. We can assume that most were doubting. Some at least were doubting. They denied and mocked. They joined right in with the scribes because that was probably a safe place to be. If you were going to be in that place and you wanted to just kind of play it safe, they're probably going to buckle to peer pressure here. They're probably going to do what the scribes do. If they have no faith, if they have no strength, and they want to avoid a problem, they're either going to fade to the back of the crowd or they're going to join right in with the rest of the world. And we see that often, don't we? The disciples had failed to help. And we'll see why soon enough. And even they, at this point, it seems even their faith was shaken at this point. Because we see later, they didn't know why this happened. So as a result, again, this man's faith, the faith, at least that little bit of faith that drove him out to shake off all the worries of all the stigmas that come with the boy's condition, the fact that he could have a seizure or have an attack while they're among the crowd, none of that mattered to the father, at least initially, enough to get him there. But now that faith is shaken. But he spoke his first need. He spoke his doubt to Jesus, standing right in front of him. He spoke his doubt, and he spoke his need for compassion. So what are we seeing here? Before this boy could be restored, before this boy could be dealt with, there had to be a restoration of this man's faith, a restoration of this man's strength, and a growing of his faith, a nurturing of his faith. Psalm 34:18 tells us, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. And that's exactly what's standing in front of Jesus right now, is a man who's brokenhearted, grieving over the condition and the suffering of his son. And it says the Lord saves those who are crushed in spirit. So remember, Jesus is now surrounded by all these people of little faith, these people of wavering faith, these people who are backing off a little bit, these people who are tending to step over here with the scribes who are mocking, dividing. Now, the last time Jesus, at least one other time that we know of that Jesus encountered this, was, we see it in Matthew 13. So this is when Jesus had revisited Nazareth. And he had been teaching in the synagogue, and they were saying, where does he get all this authority? Where does he get all this wisdom? And so they started, what? Then ridiculing him, then resisting him, then persecuting him. And what does it say in verse 58? And he did not do many miracles there because of their unbelief. Notice it doesn't say he could not do it. He did not do it. Right? He's always able. So here he is in a very similar situation. It seems he's among all these people who are doubting, these believers, we'll call them Christians, of weak faith, of shaken faith. But he shows love and mercy here, and he takes action because this man stepped out and stepped in front of him and said, help my faith, help my unbelief. Jesus said to him in response, because of mercy, he took action, and he said to him, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. So he makes it very simple for the boy's father, if you can believe. He basically said, just trust, just know, just believe. And verse 24, immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And when you read that, you may say, what? That kind of doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Lord, help. I believe, but I don't believe. Well, that's not what the man is saying here. Well, first of all, I think it's important that notice the transition that we see occur here. Earlier, when he first walks up to Jesus, he says, teacher. Now, he's saying what? Lord. Now, some translations omit that. Some translations may change that to master or something like that. But if you look at the Greek word behind it, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it because my tongue will get tied in a knot, it means Lord, Messiah. So this man in this transition, this time, this progression of faith that is weakened, starts out with teacher and is now Lord. With me? He cries out, saying, I believe, but my faith is weak. I believe, help my unbelief. It wasn't this guy's perfect religion or stature that caused Jesus to act here, was it? Help my unbelief. Those things weren't present. Perfect religion was not present in this man. Perfect faith was not present in this man. I believe, help my unbelief. So it was the father crying out in tears over the grieving, this terrible condition of his son that caused Jesus to respond in compassion and mercy and take action. But what we see and what we get a little confused about there is, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. We start out with a little bit of faith. And what that little bit of faith will do is it will reveal areas in our lives that need attention. So as we have that little bit of faith, it's going to reveal to us these areas where we tend to doubt. Everybody in here believes. But do we all doubt sometimes? So that little bit of faith reveals to us our doubt. And when we take that doubt in front of the Lord, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief, He strengthens our faith. He strengthens us, doesn't He? Now what happens then? We get a little more faith, a little stronger, maybe I shouldn't say more, stronger faith. And so it's a progression, and that's what we're seeing in this man. A progression of increasing, strengthening faith. You with me? So this guy was crying out to Jesus, despite the voices around him, despite the voices of the world that were saying, don't go there. Crying out for compassion. So what happens the moment then that this man speaks the need? Verse 25, and when Jesus saw the people came running together. When Jesus saw that the people came running together, there's something there. He rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more. Then the spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him. So Jesus restores this man's faith by action, not by rebuke. Right? Because the man calls this out to him. He says, Lord, I need faith. Help my unbelief. That shows a willingness, doesn't it? Versus what the scribes probably showed. But we see something here with the crowd. It says, when Jesus saw that the people came, or when Jesus saw that the people came running together, something happened at that moment. Something got turned over in that crowd, didn't it? Something stirred them to run together. So there was a turning point here. The account in Luke 9 says that right after, in Luke 9 it is, right after the boy was delivered to the Spirit. So immediately after, it says in verse 43, and they were all amazed at the greatness of God. So when we look at that in light of what we just read, obviously there was a great turning here. There was a moment of great, something great happened in this crowd that before maybe it was a split. Maybe they were a little bit more on the Pharisee side because they had just witnessed this failure, this moment of weakness. But now they've seen the greatness of God and they're charging forward, it says. So things were turned over here. One other interesting note. You notice here it says, deaf and dumb spirit, I command you to come out. The belief at the time was that to get a spirit out, you had to call it by name. You had to get its name. That was the belief at that time. And here we see Jesus doing that. Remember, if the boy was mute, how are they going to get his name? Jesus is showing that our power goes even beyond that. But maybe the disciples remembered that. And maybe they said, how am I going to do this? If I can't get the name of this, I'm powerless here. Maybe. I don't know. I'm speculating there. That may have been something that caused them to doubt their ability over the spirit that they were dealing with here. And it says then, continuing in verse 26, and he became as one dead, so that many said, he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. So something that's interesting here that I want to point out. Let's remember, as they're coming down the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus predicts his death to Peter, James, and John. And then this event with the boy and his father comes. And if you look past this into the very next section, what does Jesus again do? He predicts his death to the disciples. But in the middle of all this, with this story of this boy and his father, we see a picture of that, don't we? If you look at that. Jesus is painting a picture that maybe they missed and maybe we do. I mean, look at this father and this boy. The father loved his son so much that he brought him out into this world that he knew was going to ridicule him because of what he had experienced and the afflictions that he had upon him. He knew he was going to be rejected, and after he was delivered, he dies, and God lovingly reaches out his hand and lifts him up. So between these two times where Jesus predicts his own death, we have this little picture of that event. And sometimes I think we might miss that. But the boy's father said, help my unbelief. So he's speaking out to the one who is able to help him. No shame. He's not holding back. He's not worried about what the crowd's going to think. So that little bit of faith, that mustard seed, we read about that mustard seed of faith, helps him become more aware of his lack of belief. And it's the same for us. Let me get back on track here. So in verse 28, and when he had come into the house, the disciples asked him privately, why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, this kind can come out by nothing but fasting and prayer. So now this father has had his faith restored. That's his real first need, isn't it? He had to have his faith restored before they could deal with his son. And then his son is delivered and healed of this affliction. But the disciples, it seems, are puzzled by their failure here, by what happened. Why weren't we able to do it? Because if we remember back in Mark 3, they were given authority to do this. And it says it very specifically in verse 14. And he appointed 12 so that they would be with him and he could send them out to preach and to have authority to cast out the demons. But they failed to drive this one out, didn't they? And they couldn't understand why. And Jesus tells them this one can only come out by fasting and prayer. But Mark's account isn't as detailed as what we see in Matthew's in chapter 17. You don't have to turn there. Matthew chapter 17, verse 20, the same account. Verse 20, so Jesus said to them, because of your unbelief. When they asked why they weren't able to do this, he says to them very plainly, because of your unbelief. For assuredly, I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you'll be able to say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. However, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. So there was a link to prayer, fasting, and their belief, the strength of their faith, where they had kind of failed here. Let's remember back earlier in Mark 9. These 9 were left alone. Jesus was not with them. Their 3, what they would consider their 3 leaders, were not with them. So they're almost leaderless, facing these religious leaders and this great multitude. So maybe there was some insecurity in there. Maybe there was some weakness there. But according to what we read here, it says, because of your unbelief. It seems that maybe these 9 had neglected the basic necessities of a strong faith, prayer and fasting. Constant fellowship with God and a giving of ourselves. Fasting is a great, I read this and I can't remember where I read it, but fasting is a great reminder that victory doesn't come cheap all the time. We have to speak our need in prayer. We have to be willing to sacrifice ourselves to give to God and to take up our cross, and we see that in here. Some of the manuscripts, I think, and maybe some of your translations don't have the word fasting in there, but if you look at the Greek, it is in there. It does say prayer and fasting. Well, maybe they neglected to trust because their faith was weak, and their faith was weak because they neglected to pray and to fast. But he says to them, right, because of your unbelief. So there was a component missing there. And that's where they fell short. Maybe they got so wrapped up in the things they saw, the things they had been around, the events they had participated in because of proximity, maybe, I don't know, that they neglected the basics. Too many people come to church and we get tired, church or camp or wherever it is, and we get wrapped up in the wonderful, great things that happen here, and we walk out of here and we forget that we can have those same experiences at home. We forget that we can have those same moments with God in our own homes, in our own prayer closets, on our prayer chair, whatever we've got at home. We get tied up in the proximity of these things and we think, camp's over. I'm weak. We leave this place and we tie everything we feel, everything we think, all of our faith, all of our strength, we tie it to this building. We tie it to our church. We tie it to an event or a place or a concert or some speaking event, rather than just stay in constant communion and fellowship with God. The father of the boy came in faith, but his faith was swayed. He was influenced by the ways and the words of the world and the failure of the believers that he saw in front of him. And that happens to us too, doesn't it? So we have to cry out our first need, which is him. We have to cry out in faith as his father did. Help my unbelief. That spirit attacked that boy ferociously, physically, throwing him to the fire, throwing him into the water, with intent to damage, intent to do him harm, and intent to destroy him. Very violent physical attack. But make no mistake, those little whispers of the enemy in your ear that weaken you are just as damaging, just as dangerous, and they're just as destructive. They cause us to lose faith. They cause us to be weakened. Like this boy's father said, I believe, help my unbelief. I believe, therefore I recognize where I am weak. I believe, therefore I recognize the areas where I doubt. Help those areas, Lord. It's important for us to know that the world, and we saw that here with the scribes and with the crowds, the world will use the lives of Christians and the strength of the church, and not just us as believers, but they're going to use those things to create an image of who Jesus is. And it's going to affect their testimony. It's going to affect their faith, your testimony, your strength. The disciples had failed and the world was watching. And we saw what happened in the faith of this one man. Like Jesus tells them here, because of your unbelief, this kind can only come out by prayer and fasting. Sometimes we neglect prayer. We neglect time in the Word. And we rely too heavily on the experience at church, the experience at camp, the experience at the conference. We rely too heavily on the guy on TV who's preaching to us, and then we turn the TV off, and where's the zeal? We've put all our trust in what we're seeing and what we're a part of there instead of our trust and our strength being in the vertical, not the horizontal. So our faith becomes weak because we neglect the necessity and the power of things like prayer and fasting, the basics of our faith. And then we walk around like defeated Christians, and the world says, see, what good is your faith doing you? It's not our faith that's the issue, it's the weakening of our faith. So what happened here? 4 things happened. So these guys, obviously, at least according to what we read, they neglected the power of the Word and the presence that comes by staying in constant fellowship and communication with God through prayer, not proximity. It's not tied to this building. It's not tied to that event. It's not tied to camp. It's tied to your closeness and your proximity of God, your fellowship with God through prayer. Right? They felt, because their leaders were not present with them, because Jesus was far away, they felt a little vulnerable. And then, of course, the scribes took every opportunity to rub their faces in it when they fell short, when they were unable to help this boy and to influence the world around them. And as a result, the whole crowd, it seems, maybe had an atmosphere of unbelief that affected the faith of this one father trying to help this boy and seeking Jesus. But the father got it right, because he said, help my unbelief, Lord. He didn't shy away in embarrassment. How often do we come to church and we hide our baggage away because we don't want other people to know where we're weak in our lives, where we're suffering in our lives? We have the shameful affliction, and we're saying, I'm not going to reveal that. That's too embarrassing. And then it does what? It festers and it weakens our faith, and we start to, again, those destructive lies, those destructive whispers of the enemy that get in our ear and say, you can't go to God with that going on in your life. And so we become weaker. And this thing festers more and more and more. Help my unbelief. The disciples, though, the good news is the disciples got it right too in the end, didn't they? They went to Jesus and they said, what? Why couldn't we? They were seeking an answer. They were seeking growth. They were seeking spiritual maturity. It was a time of self-examination, and we've been hearing that a lot here lately. The importance of self-examination, that we realize where we need that touch from Jesus more and more and more. I'm going to speak that first to me first. Help my unbelief, Lord. The world is going to judge Christians and the church not by our appearance, but by our actions. You with me on that? Or, maybe I should add, our inaction. Right? We see this all the time. People that don't know Jesus, people that don't know who he is, people that have never been in community with him, people that don't have a relationship with him are going to form an image of him based on the way they see the Christians live their lives. And they see it on TV, and they see division in the church, and they see churches not preaching the gospel that the church is supposed to be built on, and they call Christians hypocrites. Again, that's big news when there's a scandal in the church. The Hillsong's church, I'm sure you guys saw it. Even CNN covered that. You don't see many miracles covered on CNN, but they got that one. They were covering that one constantly. The world sees us as weak when we walk around with our heads defeated, and yet we preach a message of victory. Are you with me? We have to depend on Jesus so much that prayer and fasting, right? So much that our wants for food and other things, they become secondary, they become third, fourth, fifth, sixth in our lives, like this father did. We have to trust him, we have to cry out our most shameful afflictions. And it has to be our boldness in action. Look how that father came to Jesus. In Matthew's account, I think it was, says he came to him on his knees. We have to come to God humbly and cry out our first need first, because he's asking you to tell him your story. He already knows your story. He wants to work with you here like he did when he restored Peter, right? Let's relive this moment. Let's recreate this scene for you so you can see what I have for you. His first need. We're not just empowered here on Sunday morning during worship, are we? We're empowered every day. But if we neglect prayer, if we neglect a giving of ourselves, we're going to weaken, like we saw happen here. We sang this morning, I like that song, When I Fight, I'll Fight on My Knees. Oh Lord, the battle belongs to you. That's a simple message for us, isn't it? When we're on our knees like this father was, prayer is our weapon. We are empowered and we are given authority. But again, we have to do as this boy did and speak that need. And I keep speaking that up here week after week. Prayer does four things for us. It creates that zeal, that fire within us. It brings us closer to God when we feel distant, which these guys probably felt a little distant, but they neglected prayer. Jesus told them that because of your faithlessness, because of your unbelief, because of your doubt. Like this boy's father, it demonstrates a complete trust and dependency on God. And it humbles us too. Because when we go to God in prayer, we're not asking him, we're not going to him and saying, help me do this in my own strength. We're saying, give me the strength. Right? The story we had read here today, if you look at it again and read it again, and I would encourage you to keep studying it. We face all these storms and these dilemmas and these illness in our lives, and we walk around and we think about these awful, awful things that are happening in our lives. And maybe it's not the things that are happening in our lives that are the problem. It's the things that are not happening in our lives that are the problem. More prayer. And that could be the result. Maybe our fear and our weakness and our doubt is sometimes a result of a lack of prayer, a lack of time in the Word, of not being in constant fellowship with him. Or maybe we're just too ashamed to admit our own weaknesses. So if you're tired of living in fear, if you're tired of living in doubt, if you're tired of experiencing those moments of weakness and failure in your life, do like the boy's father did here and run to him and cry out. Do as the crowd does when they see this great work of God and run to him. Do like Peter did and just throw yourself in the water. Pray right where you are, or come to the altar and we'll pray with you. And he's going to respond. How is he going to respond? Just like we saw here, he's going to empower you. He's going to give you authority over that thing in your life. He's going to give you authority over that sickness. He's going to give you authority over that spirit. He's going to give you that authority over that broken marriage. But you've got to speak that need. And he's going to ignite, or he's going to reignite, right? That zeal, that flame that we all have in us. That's the faith that moves mountains. And there is a desperate and very broken world out there right now. And they're watching what we do. They're watching Christians to say, who is this Jesus? They're watching how the church responds to a world that's kind of falling apart out there. If you haven't heard, there's a couple fires going. If you haven't heard, there's some floods going. If you haven't heard, there's a problem in Afghanistan. And if you haven't heard, there's a problem right here. And the world is watching. And how we respond, how we handle it, how we act in power and authority and absolute trust with God is going to make Some people turn their eyes to him. But if we neglect the basics, like these guys did here, then we're going to be weak, right? Amen? We have our fellowship meal. I hope everybody can stay for that today. But why don't we bless the food now, that way you can just charge the line. Lord, I thank you for this time. I thank you for your word, Lord, and I just pray that you would give us that courage, that zeal, that boldness to come before you boldly, to speak that first need, Lord, to speak when we do doubt, Lord, and trust that you'll strengthen our faith and help us to recognize other areas of our lives through self-examination that need a touch from you. Help us, Lord, to be like this Father, to come to you with submissive trust. Lord, help us to go out and to be an example, be a light to this world that's very much in need, Lord, this world that's suffering. Lord, again, I thank you for your word. I thank you for this time together today. And Lord, I thank you for the time that we're about to have. And Lord, let it be pleasing to you. Let it be a time of good fellowship. Lord, pleasing to you in your sight, Lord. Bless the food in the hands that prepared it, Lord. Bless it to our bodies in Jesus' name. Amen.